And it is wonderful. I've read it. It's terrific. It's the best O.O. McIntyre thing that I have read or seen. And I encourage you all to get that, and I guess you're going to since you're up here. But get some and give them to friends. I know I will be. And also we have with us Seth Argabright. Seth will be making his appearance tonight as O.O. McIntyre. And because we are doing the O.O. McIntyre Suite this evening with the orchestra that I've been hunting for some 25 years, it was premiered by the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, and one of his arrangers was Meredith Willson. Meredith Willson wrote the music band as well as the O.O. McIntyre Suite, so we're doing some of his work. Another one of his composers on staff was George Gershwin. George Gershwin wrote the Rhapsody in Blue in 5 weeks' time because he forgot that he had the commission. So that was in 24. But so we're doing a couple of Gershwin pieces with our singer, and because O.O. McIntyre liked to say, talk about himself as the local boy makes good, so we thought we need a soloist for this performance, and so we've got Philip Armstrong. So if you don't have your tickets, there's still a few left. You can stop by the box office on the way out. And I'm going to let these gentlemen take over now and start talking.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Mr. Williams, it's an honor to have you here today. And welcome to Gallipolis, Ohio, specifically the Ariel Opera House. We'll get right into the questions if you don't mind.
Sure.
The first question I have for you is, how did you get started writing about history?
I've always been a fan of history. I spend a lot of time reading history books and, of course, working in the museum business. I am very much passionate. I work alongside a lot of fantastic archivists and museum professionals, so that also intrigued me. But the original seed of really starting to write about history came when I was working for Elvis Presley Enterprises, so I worked for the King of Rock and Roll, and we had an Elvis exhibit at the museum. And so I went along with the Elvis artifacts to help organize and to be the contact. And on the way out, I stopped and there was a book on Abraham Lincoln called Manhunt, on the search for the killer of Abraham Lincoln. I picked that up. The museum actually had an exhibit on it. I was fascinated by the book to such a degree that I started researching my own ancestry and researching to the point that I started wanting to write about it, so I did a blog. And I wrote the blog about history and about my own ancestry and researching the family lines. And a book publisher read my blog about Richard Halliburton, who I had blogged about because he's from my hometown. And they said, we really like this blog. Would you like to write a book? Well, I hadn't really thought about writing a book, but I figured, well, okay, yeah, I'll give it a shot. So I wrote the first one, and that's what sort of inspired me to start writing.
Excellent, excellent. And you mentioned the museum a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Could you just briefly describe for us what the museum is?
Well, the museum is so big and fantastic, it's hard to describe it briefly. But in a nutshell, it is a museum of free expression and the First Amendment. We're on Pennsylvania Avenue, right between the Capitol and the White House. We celebrate journalism and freedom of the press, but also free expression and the right for people to protest. Of course, we're all in a very interesting time in American politics, so it's a fascinating time to be able to be on Pennsylvania Avenue. And frequently, at least once a week, I look out my office window and see a group of protesters walking down the street celebrating our American rights to protest. So we have exhibits like the largest section of the Berlin Wall. We have the top of the World Trade Center. It's loaded with all types of artifacts and stories that tell about how our rights as Americans have been applied through the years and how they're still being applied.
Understandable. Tell me a little bit about this current book that you're releasing regarding O.O. McIntyre.
Sure, absolutely. Well, probably everybody in here is well aware of O.O. McIntyre, so I won't have to go into too much detail with you all, but I stumbled across some things that O.O. McIntyre had written when I wrote my first book, and I really just liked the style of what he had written. I liked the style of how he used language to communicate an idea. And after I looked at what he had written about Richard Halliburton, I went ahead and started looking at more of what he wrote. And the more I looked at, the more I was interested in. So what was most interesting to me was the storyline, the arc of the storyline of his life. You know, he came from here, where he was raised by his grandmother, and he ended up, you know, fast forward towards the end of his life, and he was the most read, highest paid columnist in the entire world. And so to me, the way he got there was fascinating. And then also the fact that he was battling an illness. You know, every story needs to have a protagonist and an antagonist and a hero. Well, in his case, the antagonist was the sickness that he was suffering from that he didn't even really know he had. Of course, he and his wife and his friends knew he had the symptoms, but they didn't have a name to pin on it like we would have today. And today, the disease is called pernicious anemia. If he had had it today, he would have been treated right away, and he wouldn't have suffered all the different side effects that he suffered through his whole life, and eventually it's what did finally kill him. So just the whole storyline is what fascinated me about Odd. And it's been really fun introducing people all over the world to Odd McIntyre, people who've never heard of him. A lot of people say to me, you know, why have I never heard of this person? And so it's been really fun to introduce him to the world.
Sure. Was his name really Odd?
His name was really Odd. Some people say that it's pronounced Ud, but I did double check with people who knew him and his wife, and his wife did refer to him as Odd. His uncle's name was Oscar Odd, and it was his mother's brother, and so she picked that name. It would be difficult to saddle someone with the name Odd, but they did, and perhaps the word odd wasn't perhaps used as often as we use it today to describe something strange and unusual, but it did end up well identifying some of the strange traits that he had as a result of the disease that he was struggling with.
Okay, could you expand on the traits?
Sure. You know, some of the things that he dealt with that are common symptoms of pernicious anemia back in the day, hallucinations, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder. He had a lot of obsessive-compulsive disorder traits. And he and his wife were also Christian scientists. She was a little more of a Christian scientist, I think, than he was. And so they wouldn't go to the doctor, and they wouldn't talk about their sickness. And so they learned how to only let certain friends in close enough who wouldn't necessarily talk to them about the illness and would let it go on. But he was afraid to leave the house frequently, as a lot of people who have, you know, obsessive compulsive disorders are. He was afraid people would flick lint off of his shirt. He was incredibly shy, which is also ironic when you think about what he was doing with his career. But he suffered with intense shyness, was obsessed with not speaking to the person that he talked to. A person that he met, he was afraid to speak to them for the second time he met them until they spoke to him first. So he had a lot of very strange behaviors, while at the same time he was very kind and very much excited about being in New York and being around all this activity. So he was a man of many great things that conflicted with each other. He also bought hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of clothes and never wore them, because they were very poor at one time, and he was always afraid he would become poor again. So he had hundreds of thousands of dollars of shirts and suits and pants and canes and hats, all stored away that he would buy and that were never used. You know, another somewhat odd thing that they did, they bought Gatewood, which of course all of you know where Gatewood is. They bought Gatewood and completely refurbished it from New York. And I read a lot of the letters that Maybelle sent here to the family members that were helping her redecorate, but they completely redid the whole house without ever coming here. And according to what I read, the whole house would have seemed as though Odd were there. You know, they had, the O.O. McIntyre and McIntyre and her name. Everything was there as though they lived there. And yeah, they didn't actually get to enjoy it until the first time she walked in the house was to make arrangements for the visitation that was going to take place after his death, after his body was put in there. So he never actually got to see it.
His wife was a big part of his success, was she not?
Yeah, I think that was the other thing that I hope comes out in the book, is it's actually also, it's really a powerful love story that here, they met here in Gallipolis, and I actually have, back there on the table, everybody should pick up one. There's a Cosmopolitan magazine article that he wrote about, and I made a copy of it, because it's about his wife, and it's about how they met when they were very young. I read a lot of O.O. McIntyre while I was researching for the book. I read pretty much every article, which is like thousands of articles. I read all the Cosmopolitan articles. And the challenge with writing about Odd McIntyre is that oftentimes a story like How I Met My Wife, he would tell it a different way, like 5 different times. So there were actually 5 or 6 different ways he met his wife. His wife even had a couple ways that she said they met for the first time. So so what I tried to do was try to find, proof of the different stories that I put in the book, or I would acknowledge that, it's not proven. But they either met at church, at the Methodist church, or they met in class when they were taking a school picture. They didn't, but the one story they were the most, they agreed upon was when they first started actually dating, was when they were on a hayride with their church, and he sat next to her on the hayride, and then from then on he carried her books home from school, and that's when they first started dating. She actually went away to finishing school while he was off trying to write. They didn't get married until much later than people did back then, because he really didn't want to get married until he could actually support her, and that took a long time. But when they did finally get married, his illness had to be a huge burden on her, trying to live a life in New York. They went to New York. The magazine that they went there to work on closed, shut down, quit publishing almost, very soon after they got there. So here she was in this little tiny apartment in New York, knowing very few people. He was so depressed he could not get out of bed. So he laid in the fetal position, sobbing in the bed for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so finally, she said to him, look, you gotta get going again. You gotta get started. She's the one who talked him into setting up his typewriter. She said, you know how you always type letters and you send them to our friends and family back in Gallipolis? Why don't you do that? Write the letters, and I'll send them around to newspapers all over the country. And so back in those days, and I read a few of them, when people like from Gallipolis or from other small towns would go out of town on vacation or would go for an extended period, they would send letters back to the newspaper, and the newspaper would type the letter from the person who was traveling to the people in the community. And so Odd, wrote letters. Well, his wife thought these are really good, so she bought a mimeograph machine. They had a relative pass away, and so they had a little bit of money. They bought a mimeograph machine, and she would take what he wrote, and she would make copies of it, and she would send it all over the nation, and said, use it for free. Don't even pay anything. And so they did that. He was inspired by having to write the article, so he started going out. He left their apartment and went out into the world, and from there he got a job on Tin Pan Alley, writing for some of the musicians, and he got to know a lot of the musicians. From here at the Ariel, we're in the Ariel. From here in the Ariel, he loved vaudeville, he loved show business, he loved coming here. He was an usher part of the time. He loved this whole space. So when he was in New York, suddenly he was able to see a lot of the vaudeville stars in person that he had read about or that he had seen show bills about. And so then from there he began working for them as a publicist. With all his newspaper experience, he knew how to get a story in the newspaper. From there, he ended up being Ziegfeld's press agent for a number of years. And so he continued to meet all these famous people, and the famous people really loved him. I'm sure they loved him because he had a great personality and he was a nice guy, but also because his wife, he was writing their names in these newspaper articles, and his wife was sending them all over the United States. So his wife is the one who really does get the credit for being the one who sort of got their career going. Now, fast forward, around that time, everybody, they tried to get their newspaper column syndicated, and everybody said, nobody's going to syndicate that. They went to every syndicator in New York. They said, nobody will read this. We're not going to syndicate you. Well, fast forward about 15 years, and everybody wanted to syndicate them. So suddenly, he had more circulation than just about any other columnist. So it was up to his wife, because he was a terrible businessman, and as I said earlier, he was shy. So his wife is the one who went in and negotiated the contract. And when she walked out of the New York office, and there were a group of lawyers across the table from her, and she wrote later that she was so nervous that she took her hands and put them inside her muff because they were shaking so bad, and she didn't want to let them see that they had intimidated her. So she walked out of there with the highest contract of any other columnist in the world to that point. So she did a really good job. So she deserves all the credit.
Absolutely. In what you described of Odd McIntyre, his illness has either been an undercurrent or has completely encompassed his life. Mm-hmm. Did he include anything about his illness in his writing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Odd McIntyre humorously referred to a lot of the things that, if you looked a little beneath the surface, they can be attributed to his illness. He wasn't shy about writing that he suffered from periods of depression. He did write about that, and back then a lot of people didn't mention that they were depressed. People suffered with illnesses like that and never told anybody. So he occasionally talked about the depression that he dealt with. He also talked about his owning thousands of clothes. He ended up eventually living, and this is another interesting thing that he did. He would, if he wrote an article about you and he mentioned you in his column, he would turn around and mail that column to you from a newspaper and said, I thought you'd like to see this. Well, of course, that just made him even more popular, made him even bigger. So finally, he did that for a hotel called the Majestic, which was a big, fancy hotel that was one of the best and the most fun in New York at the time. And Copeland Townsend, who ran the hotel, said, I tell you what, if you can get me, he wrote, I saw Copeland Townsend, he wrote about it in his column. He said, if you can get me publicity like that, you can just come live here free. So Maybelle and Odd went and lived for free for many years in this hotel. He also said, you can throw as many parties as you want, we'll pay for everything. You can have as many dinners as you want. So suddenly they were really living high-end, they had the best of everything. They were living with, billionaires, I guess millionaires at the time. They were living with millionaires, movie stars, or radio stars, and not paying for a thing. And the whole time, Maybelle was putting all the money they were making in savings. So she was saving it up. I forgot what the question was, but that was a long answer.
I think you covered
Okay,
it.
good.
You've also covered, I think, this next question. It is, was there interest in what he was writing about outside New York? Now, let me expand on that and ask if you can describe what his actual readership was like in terms of numbers.
Sure. What's interesting is that towards the end of his life, his syndicate had figured out that he had about 100 million readers every day. So to put that into perspective, today, a show like Late Night or one of the late night talk shows will be happy if they have 2 million viewers. So to have 100 million readers a day is mind-boggling today. And the reason, there's a lot of reasons for this, but one reason is this. So Odd was from here in Gallipolis, and he moved to New York. He never forgot about Gallipolis. He never tried to be better than that. In fact, he sort of positioned himself as the small town boy who's in the big city, and he wrote about if he encountered Charlie Chaplin on the street, he wrote from the way that someone would write who wasn't jaded. He wrote about how excited he was to see him. And there's a lot of quotes and things like that in the book, but I think people in small towns were fascinated by what he was writing, and so they could relate. It would be the way that they would feel if they were to go to New York or Hollywood or London or Paris. He also, I mean, he was wearing, you know, the finest clothes. He bought his clothes in Paris. He was wearing the finest suits. He was wearing only the best clothes, but he was doing it in such a way and kind of making fun of himself for it that it became part of his brand, and people still could relate to him. If he were to write that he misses the blackberry jelly that he had in Gallipolis, then he would get case after case after case of jelly delivered to his hotel. He would send it like to the children's home or the hospital because A, he was kind, and B, he was afraid he would be poisoned. So he didn't want to eat any of it. And then one was really funny. He said that he said that he had mentioned that his bathrobe was getting old, and so he needed a new one, and hundreds of bathrobes came in. So he said he noticed his limousine was starting to, get kind of old now, and, but no limousines.
No takers on
no,
that.
Yeah, no limousines showed up.
Nice. What would you say your biggest challenge, if any, was in writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is just the amount of time between, his death and now, and trying to find as much. I wanted it to be completely factual, so trying to find the facts and make sure I'm getting just what is truth for a person who oftentimes stretched the truth to be entertaining. While he appreciated and loved journalists and loved the newspaper business, he never saw himself as a journalist, so he didn't feel the responsibility to write factually. And so if he said that he had lunch with Charlie Chaplin that day, you don't necessarily know that he really did. So it was trying to find the evidence, and I found some fascinating things. He talked about being in a bar in Paris called Harry's New York Bar. I think that's right, Harry's New York Pub or something like that. And so he talked a lot about how he was there, and so I was like, I don't know if that's really true or not. So I tried to corroborate it. And in that bar, through the research, was the fact that F. Scott Fitzgerald, wrote it there. It's mentioned in some of the James Bond stories, like they talk about Harry's New York Bar. And I really tried to find somebody to say that Odd McIntyre was as much of a part of that as he said he was. And then finally on eBay, I found an old, it was kind of a menu, but it was like a joke menu, and it was from Harry's New York Bar. And I opened it up and looked on the inside, and it talked about the head. I forgot what it's called. They called themselves the IBF, something having to do with drinking. I don't go in bars and drink like they did. So, but it was. Do you remember? It was,
the BF is barflies.
Barflies, international barflies. That's right, yeah. So Lance is from Las Vegas. He's a big Odd fan and a collector. So he and his wife are here all the way from Las Vegas. You'll have to talk to them after. He knows more about Odd than I do. Anyway, so I found this like fake menu, and it said the head IBF was O.O. McIntyre. And so, I put a picture of it in the book because it was probably one of my most exciting finds was to find that, proof that he was actually there in Paris. And my daughter, this is Liv, my daughter, she was actually in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and I made her go there and take a picture of my book in front of that bar. So, but anyway, so it was, the biggest challenge was trying to just research and verify everything that I was going to put down as fact. And honestly, there's not been much written about him all pulled together. So that was the biggest challenge, was trying to find that.
I see. Did the fact that you work at the museum influence the book in any way?
Oh, of course. When you're trying to write a biography, of course, everybody writes through the prism of their own experiences. With me, working at the museum, I get to work, around so many really talented writers and archivists and museum professionals. For this particular book, Odd was, while he didn't consider himself a reporter at the end, early in his career, he wanted to be a reporter. So he worked here, for the newspaper in Gallipolis, and he would go to the park and interview people to try to find stories about what was happening here in Gallipolis and what was going on in the neighboring communities. So being a reporter is what he started off wanting to be. He worked for the Cincinnati Post during a time when they had a city boss called Boss Cox, who was, like all city bosses, in control of everything that was going on in the community. And in Cincinnati, he actually kept schools from being developed and kept city parks from being developed. He had such a tight rein. And so the people of Cincinnati Post, including Odd, were working hard to try to bring him down, to try to bring down this city boss who was really doing harm to the city. And so he got to see a lot of really great muckrakers in action. So Ida Tarbell is one, Lincoln Steffens is another that he actually, and those are in the news in the museum business, in the news museum business, those are big names. And so he was actually there. And so, of course, that I gravitated a little bit more to the things he did early as a reporter because of the museum. He also was one of the first, when he worked for a while in Dayton, Ohio, and he was one of the very first people to interview two guys who were working on a flying machine in a little house out back, and it was the Wright brothers. And so he was one of the very first journalists to interview. He wrote he didn't write the very first, but he wrote one of the very first stories in the Wright brothers. He was there when the Titanic survivors stepped off of the Carpathia onto the dock. He was there to interview them. And so a lot of the stories that you hear, the things that you watch Leonardo DiCaprio do in Titanic, Odd was the one who got a lot of those stories and wrote them down for the newspaper. And so he worked 48 hours straight, he said, and he worked 48 hours straight and got home and went to bed, and Maybelle woke him up a little while later because the paper had come out and it had his byline on it. That's the most thing that I wished I could have found, but I couldn't find that issue of that particular paper that he was working for. And I don't know if any have been archived, but I've looked and looked and looked, and I really wanted to find that to put into the book, but I could never find it.
Okay. It's a fascinating story at any rate.
Yeah.
You self-published this book rather than going with a traditional publisher, is that correct?
Yeah. Nowadays, and a lot of you probably have stories that you want to write, or maybe you've already written one. The way it used to work is if you wanted to get a book published, you had to find an agent, and an agent would find a publishing company, and that publishing company would decide whether or not they thought there was a market for your book, whether they could sell your book. Well, the problem with the publishing industry is that now, like the music industry and like music, like news, the industry that I'm in, like the news industry, the economics have shifted to the point where they can't make any money selling smaller, niche-oriented books. So the big publishers are not going to publish books like mine. But thanks to Amazon, you take your book, and if you have just some basic skills, if you take your book, you can publish it yourself on Amazon, and so you can make it available to your friends and family and anyone else. And so you don't have to have a publisher. You don't have to have an agent. You can go directly online and do everything. And so to me, it's really a revolution that's going on in the printing industry, because there are so many people out there that have stories that need to be told, that have stories. And this was what first got me excited about genealogy and history research, is if you don't get those stories down on paper, then they're going to be forgotten whenever all of us are gone and there's a whole new batch of folks in here. If we don't be responsible with our histories and don't get them down on paper, then poof, it's all gone. So that's why I was really excited about this. I actually talked to an agent about this book, and she said to me, why would anybody want to buy a book that about someone no one's ever heard of? And so I said, well, that's a great point, but that's exactly why I want to do the book. So anyway, so her loss, right?
So as a self-publisher then, have you been advertising on social media or any other outlets?
Yeah, you clearly don't follow me, or else you would know that I'm driving people crazy.
Well, I'll make sure I follow you after today.
No, I know my friends are like, oh, I'll be so glad when he's done promoting that book. So, no, but yeah, follow me on Facebook. You can go to anoddbook.com, and you can, towards the bottom, I have a LinkedIn account for Odd, where I'm posting the pictures of the people, places, and things that Odd wrote about. And it's really been a blast, posting. Then also on my website, anoddbook.com, I have a blog. Every Friday, Odd blogs a little short something that I pulled out of his original writing. So what was fascinating to me in trying to, obviously I look through and try to curate something that is applicable still. It's amazing how much he wrote about that are just general, broad observations that are just as applicable today as they were back in the early 20s. So every Friday that comes out. Of course, there's a Facebook page and there's a YouTube channel. And so, yeah, I mean, that's been the thing about Odd McIntyre is, while he didn't realize it, he was creating a wealth of content that's what I'm really most excited about, is getting that back out so that people can see it. He also tweets multiple times a day. So you can actually go to Odd's Twitter account and see, and those of you who tweet know that it has to be very, very short. And Odd, I mean, the way he wrote in very short, very quick little sentences. And so those make perfect tweets. So you can go on there and see the tweets as well.
He was the original user of 140 characters.
Absolutely, yeah. There is no question that he was one of the very first people who, and that's what a lot of people back then who were fans of his, they did observe that he could say more with less words than just about any other writer of that era.
Sure. What do you think he would think of the world today if he were around, if he were still alive?
I mean, that's of course, it's dangerous when you start to think what if, but I do think he would, first of all, be able to have received treatment for pernicious anemia, so he wouldn't have to deal with so much of that. I also think he would love what's going on in the news business, in communication. We are all part of a very rapid shift and a very rapid change in the way people get their information, their communication, their news, everything. And so I think he would be like he was back then. He was living in a time when, early in his career, when everything was shifting to the small towns and the small communities, mostly had, farmers, people were moving into the cities. And so there was this rapid shift to urban lifestyles. And in the 20s, there was a real conflict between people who wanted to keep things the way they were. They wanted to keep things, kind of the way they were in the Victorian era, versus people who were just wanting to cut loose and put the throttle on wide open. And Odd was there to observe and write. And so we're here once again in a time when things are changing fast. We have such conflict in our country. And I think he would be able to write about that and observe it in such a way. And that's the way he did back then. Both sides could read what he wrote. He didn't write one side or the other. He truly wrote in such a way so that everybody could enjoy it. And I think he would be doing that again.
I agree. On my way in, I was handed this. It appears to be a typewritten sheet of paper of some sort. Could you describe that to us?
Yeah, I made a copy for everybody of this. This is what Odd's column looked like when he would type it up. So he was always afraid he was going to die and leave columns, not ready. So he always produced way more work than he needed to. And then he would cut it out in strips and put it together to make a column. Then he would write in red on top of the column where he wanted to make changes. And it would take him pretty much most of the afternoon and some of the evening to write. And he would do 2 or 3. And I write in the book about his whole process that he developed that worked for him. He never changed it. Once he got a process. This one I thought was particularly interesting because he talks about being a boy in Gallipolis. And so I thought it was really interesting for you all to read what he wrote. And he really, really wrote about I was blown away with how much he wrote about Gallipolis in his columns and his articles. And I mean, you would think that, he moved away and never came back, but he never stopped talking about it. It was as though he had been here last week. He mentioned to all his friends over and over and over again, his buddies that he was friends with, his family members. He truly loved this town and wrote about it constantly. So I know a lot of people back in the day would come here specifically because they had read about it in his columns and articles, and they wanted to see what he was writing about.
Thank you for answering these questions.
Yeah.
The author is R. Scott Williams. The book is an Odd book, biography of Oscar Odd McIntyre. That's all the questions I have, but would you like to field any questions?
Yeah,
from the
absolutely.
audience?
Yeah.
Anybody have a question?
Scott, I'd like to thank you for writing the book. And I want to compliment you on writing the book that my wife and I found most engaging.
Thank you.
The style is very readable.
Oh, thank you.
Why do you suppose that he just dropped off the face of the earth? That nobody knows who he is when everybody knows about the people that he wrote about?
Right, that's a great question. I think the reason is because he was so shy that when everybody else started getting on the radio and then started getting in silent pictures, he preferred to just stay behind and his typewriter. So he was given millions of dollars eventually worth of opportunity. You know, people would say, "Will you endorse this product? Will you do this radio show? Will you?" And he did none of it. Whereas Walter Winchell, with whom he had sort of a battle going on, Walter Winchell was right there on the radio, and then, you know, he took advantage of all the mediums. And Odd never went beyond print. And back then also, there was just such a lot of print, you know. So, you know, he died in 1938, so it was, you know, right before the war, and everything kind of changed again. And so that's the only thing I can attribute it to, because honestly, with the stuff that I read of his, to me, is so engaging, you know, that to me, I mean, it really reads like poetry sometimes, or a novel sometimes. So hopefully, you know, we'll bring him back to the surface. I'm curious, what you're a collector and a fan, and what attracted you towards Odd McIntyre?
Well, he was born in the town, Plattsburgh, Missouri, that my family was from. I never lived in Missouri, but my mother was born there. And they went back to the 1840s in Plattsburgh, and he was one of two authors that came out of this little town of 2,500 people. So I've been going back there since I was a child. That was the only place we ever went on vacation, and I would take the literary tour of Plattsburgh, which consisted of Odd McIntyre's father, Hugh, I think his name was, his house, and the other house was J. Breckenridge Ellis, who had the 10th best-selling book in 1912. So that's the author's tour of Plattsburgh.
Yeah, that's great.
And then I just kind of read the books. I read the Driscoll book, and eBay came along, and I found this wonderful, inexpensive hobby. Inexpensive until this trip. So that's kind of how I got it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, eBay is fascinating because I have Odd McIntyre as, you know, a search whenever somebody puts, and it is really interesting. There's quite a bit of things like the little books that came out. Cosmopolitan used to take his columns and put them together in a little book that you would get for free. If you subscribe to Cosmopolitan, you would get a little O.O. McIntyre book. So there's a few of those out there. And then he had a couple of other books that were compilations. But, you know, honestly, those were usually of his magazine articles. I really like his newspaper writing better. And if anybody has, there's a website called newspapers.com. And, you know, you have to have a subscription to it, but it's not expensive. But if you search O.O. McIntyre, you can go back and read all the columns he ever wrote. And I've literally spent 1,000 hours, like, reading, you know, every one of them and looking for things. So it's if you're from here and you're curious about Odd McIntyre, that's a great way to read more about what he wrote for yourself, you know, and to sort of get a sense. Now, my problem is, because I love history so much, that as I'm reading, I always get sucked into something, a story next to it, like a news story about somebody that died, you know, 100 years ago, and then I get interested in that and start researching that, and, you know, anyway, so it's dangerous for me to get on there for too long.
Other questions?
What was his education?
You know what? That's really, you have a book now, so you can read the story about how much he hated the school here, and he hated all the teachers, and most of the teachers, and the principal especially was really horrible to him. And I don't know if he had some kind of attention deficit disorder, but whatever he had, they were not prepared to deal with him. And of course, he was raised, his father was in Plattsburgh, Missouri, and he was raised by his grandmother, and she was also ill-equipped to handle his behavioral problems. And he would, like, once he skipped not just a day or a week, he skipped an entire term. And he would hang out in the creek over here. What's the name of it? The
Chickamauga?
Thank you. Yeah, I can never say that right. So he hung out at the creek for a whole semester until he finally got busted out. He never finished high school, and he wrote, as he said, by ear. But he loved the newspaper, and he would follow the reporter around town, and they finally put him to work here in the newspaper in town, and he would set the type and clean up, but his father wasn't about to let him be in the newspaper business. His father wanted him to be in the hotel business like he was, and he thought that the newspaper business was not a righteous business for somebody to be in. So anyway, that brought a lot of conflict. And you know what's interesting is he never did sort of, he was always seeking approval from his father, and he never got it. I thought it was interesting. One of the things that I found in the research was Odd's father had to be in his late 60s, 70s. He was an old man, and Odd was, a very successful person. But when he renewed his agreement with the McNaught Syndicate, and he had the president send Odd's father a letter telling him how much Odd was making, because he was still trying to get that approval and validation from his father all those years later. So,
the gentleman back here had a question. Yes, sir.
You talk about how Odd learned to say more with less. Do you feel like journalism could look back and what could they learn from him today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think he was writing. He was not writing in the typical journalism style of, the order that you put the information that you provide or the detail that you have to go in. So he was really writing more to entertain than anything else. And he actually said that. He said, I don't feel like what I write is going to last any more than a couple of days, and I really just do it, to entertain. And so, he didn't do a lot of research. So I think writers could learn a lot from what he wrote. Maybe not journalists, but writers absolutely could. There's a part of his columns called Thoughts While Strolling, which is also the name of one of the pieces that was written that you'll hear tonight. But he wrote Thoughts While Strolling, and supposedly, and this is what bothered a lot of serious, legitimate journalists and writers, is he would write Thoughts While Strolling, and then he would kind of write what he was thinking about while he was strolling. But people who were from New York knew that it was absolutely physically impossible for somebody to get from the point where he observed one thing to the point where he observed something else that quickly, So, but he never really implied that this was a news article about what somebody was watching while they were strolling. He was entertaining, and it really, truly. I would read some of it, and I would go back and read it 3 or 4 times because I would think that is really fascinating the way he connected all those thoughts, And sometimes it would be somewhat silly, or it would make no sense, but somehow the way he presented it, it really was poetic. And so I do hope people will read it and discover more of kind of his style, not for journalism necessarily, but for writing.
One more question. Yes.
What became of his wife after he passed away?
That is a great question, and you know what? I can answer a little bit, but how many of you in here actually saw or talked to or knew his wife when she was here? Yeah, there's a lot of you. So she spent a lot of time in Paris, a lot of time in New York, but a lot of time here in Gallipolis. And she, from everything that I've read, was very proud of her house here at Gatewood. She was very proud of her the contributions that she had made to her husband's career. And she ended up in a nursing home, and she died when she was 101. So she lived a very, very long time after he died, and she lived very well. She, from what everyone's told me, that she would come here into Gallipolis, and she always drove a limousine or rode in a limousine with a driver until it became difficult to get the parts for the limousine that she liked. So she had to go to a Lincoln Town Car or something like that.
She had an old Rolls.
There you go.
She
Yeah.
had an old Rolls.
Yeah.
And Bus Lee was the person who drove for her.
Yeah, see, you guys lived it. You guys lived that part of the story. So, and that's one of the things, honestly, that made it so fun to write the book. Was I came here to visit many times and talked to a lot of people who knew her, and so yeah, it was really a fascinating story. And his connection to this town, is something that's really interesting. a lot of people, I came from, before I worked at the museum, I worked for Elvis Presley Enterprises at Graceland, and I always thought, the fact that Elvis had a Graceland, that everybody who likes Elvis music has a place to go to celebrate him, is a big reason why Elvis is, one of the reasons why Elvis was successful. And so I think the fact that Odd had Gallipolis and Gatewood is a really interesting part of who he was. So I think you guys should start doing an Odd McIntyre week every year and have people come in from all over the world.
You too?
Just like I'll come, yeah, just like Elvis, yeah. I'll be Colonel Parker.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Mr. Williams.
Yeah, thank
for
you
your
very
time
much.
today. And
Appreciate it.